Okay. Good morning. It is Empowered Education Thursday. I'm so excited. So this is our last week. This is the last week of ISM week. This series has been so fun to do. The subject matter is never, never happy. We're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about oppression, we're talking about all these things that are so important. And that's why I love this series, is that we are looking at the ugliness of our society and facing it head on, and then finding ways to be able to invoke lasting change and create a world that will be better for our future kids and the future humans of this world. So I'm so excited that you are here joining us. If this is your first time tuning in to one of our education presentations, then make sure to just go to the videos after this presentation and say see all the videos, because they're all posted after the live. They're all posted, and they're there forever. So all of the videos from our ISM Week series are here on our Facebook page under videos. We still have time, so if you want to go and grab you some tea or get you some coffee or anything like that as we have these conversations, I always feel like it's nice to, get some tea. It's good for the soul, or coffee if you're a coffee drinker. Leave a comment below if you are a coffee drinker or if you are a tea drinker. I am a tea drinker. My name is Danielle, and I am the education specialist here at the Turning Point Rape Crisis Center. I'm so excited that you joined us. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to our organization. It means a lot to our organization whenever you tune in and try and invoke lasting change. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is our presentation. It takes unity. It's a bystander's guide on being empowered and educated, because once we're educated about the problem, we can be the change to fix it and support survivors along the way. So this is the Turning Point. If you're watching this, you're watching it on our Turning Point Facebook Live page. And the Turning Point is the Rape Crisis Center of Collin County. So we have services for survivors of sexual violence and their friends and family members. So to get involved with our services, you can call our 24-hour crisis hotline, which is 1-800-886-7273. At that number, we will always have an advocate on the line who can answer any questions revolving around sexual violence, getting involved with counseling, and even scheduling a SANE exam. So I'll get into more detail about each of those three things that we offer. So counseling, number one, we offer free counseling services for survivors of sexual violence and their friends and family members. We want to make sure that everyone is supported during that time on working through that trauma, and we don't feel like you should have to pay for it or anything like that. So that's something that's so important to us, is getting everybody involved in counseling and working through that trauma and processing that trauma. And then the next thing we offer is advocacy. So this is where we go into the hospital and support survivors during their sexual assault nurse examination. So we go to the hospital, we let them know their rights, we provide support, we give them any resources they may need, and we also get them involved with any counseling or any other services that may be deemed necessary for their personal circumstance. And so overall advocacy is us being there for the survivor in any possible way that we can, and trying to make an ugly experience or a thing that you have to do after such a traumatic experience a little less painful, and just support them and provide them with all sorts of resources and things like that. So next, we offer education. So education is me. I go into the community on different platforms and things like that to be able to provide resources and education to the public in our community, in our schools, to be able to educate on sexual violence and its prevalence and its causes, and being able to create lasting change, because that's what we want to do at the end of the day. We want to be the change that we want to see in the world. So Our mission is to highlight the impact of sexual violence on individuals and our community through education programs that foster hope, encourage change, and prevent sexual violence. Join us in the fight against sexual violence. The Turning Point is committed to reducing the prevalence of sexual violence in our community. We firmly believe that for this change to occur, each person has a responsibility and must do their part to prevent sexual violence. Today, we're going to be talking about ableism. This is the last ism of our Ism Week series. You guys have seemed to really enjoy it, and I'm so happy that you guys have enjoyed our other presentations on racism, sexism, elitism, classism, and ageism. If you've missed any of those, be sure to go check them out, and that will mean a lot to us, and it also creates lasting change. So today we're talking about ableism. So sexual violence and the isms. So discussions about intersecting identities, oppression, and social justice have been a part of anti-violence movements for a long time. Many movement members have adopted a framework for discussing the continuum of sexual violence within the context of oppression and isms. So the same attitudes and behaviors that allow for sexual violence in our culture are reinforced and rooted in sexism, racism, ableism, ageism, elitism, and more. So there's a theme of intolerance towards the other who is different from the members of the majority group. So the definition. Ableism is discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities or who are perceived to have disabilities. Ableism characterizes persons as defined by their disabilities and as inferior to the non-disabled. Ableism and ableist views are ways in which ideas and beliefs are organized and supported that is based on the belief that the able-bodied is preferred over the disabled body. Similar to the experience of racism, homophobia, transphobia, and sexism, it is the socially constructed characteristics of disability that positions people with disabilities as an inferior group to non-disabled people. Society includes disabled people who have abilities that differ from the majority. This doesn't mean that we minimize or ignore the impairment, because most of the time the right supports are in place. All people can be included in their community. Ableism adheres to the medical model whereby people or women are defined by their disability and where the focus of the individual's deviation from the norm rather than recognizing everyone's individuality and specific sets of experiences. The problem with the medical model and its homogeneity, I can't say the word, is the lack of recognition of the individuality of each and every person and how we are encouraged to define people by their impairment rather than seeing the person first. Similarly, autism can be defined as the devaluation of people who are deafened, or hard of hearing. An example of this would be assuming that sign language is an inferior language and or the cultural ways of deaf people are somehow inferior. Thus, mythologies about disability and gendered violence live strongly for women living with impairments or a difference. Furthermore, ableism dictates the kinds of services women with disabilities have available and are able to access. For example, limited access to sexual health information for women with disabilities is based on the belief that disabled women will not be sexually active and therefore will not need reliable sexual health and reproductive health information. The result is an increase in the risk for sexual and physical abuse of women with disabilities. Now, when we say women with disabilities, we're not negating or erasing male victims of sexual violence. We are just speaking in the more broad context of sexual violence being a crime that is predominantly perpetrated by men with predominantly female survivors. Now, that does not mean that women cannot be perpetrators and men cannot be victims, and vice versa. It is a statistical difference in out of every 10 sexual assaults, 9 are women and 1 is a man. And so when we use these broad terms, we are not erasing male survivors, and you're seen, you're valid, and you're heard, and we are here for you. So I don't want that to be misconstrued at all. So, ableism is a form of violence that occurs on multiple levels. For instance, at the individual level, abuse can be directed towards disabled victims who are seen as less than human. And at the systems level, disabled survivors can become disenfranchised because they attempt to move through the institutions that were intended to respond to violence and abuse. Many institutions and the policies that regulate how services slash responses occur fail dramatically because of the patriarchal system that is paternalistic towards women survivors living without disabilities while indifferent to women with disabilities. Practices and directives that often drive institutional responses are steeped in racism, sexism, heterosexism, colonialism, and ableism. For example, the justice system has had an extremely flawed history in supporting women survivors of all forms of violence. So our history and our judicial system has not been to support women survivors in any capacity. It's actually been a lot harder for women survivors to have their voices heard and to have justice. So for this and other various reasons, we know that many women do not report sexual assaults perpetrated by men. Ableism, autism, and with sexism work together, as many female disabled and deaf survivors of violence are often not believed nor seen as credible victims slash witnesses by the justice system. We have little substantial research undertaken to look at the experiences of disabled women in accessing the legal and justice systems. What we do know is that women are simply not going through the system, except in rare cases where they have had the support to disclose and report violence to police. Stereotypes held by police officers impact greatly on whether a woman's report slash disclosure will move beyond the investigating officer. For example, believing her report lacks credibility because a woman with disabilities does not fit the officer's stereotype conception of who experiences sexual assault. So let's get into the public health model. So in our public health model, we go over it in every presentation, especially this ISM series. We define the problem. So the problem this week is ableism. We identify the risk and protective factors. So we want to be able to identify the fact that stereotypes and negative ideas about people who are disabled creates a risk factor for having a higher prevalence of sexual violence and a lower chance of justice. And so when we know these, risk and protective factors, and we can develop and test prevention strategies and then ensure widespread adoption. Now, we will not always have the answers, but with sharing resources and sharing the information, we can all put our heads together and try and find ideas and ways to create a safer environment and find prevention strategies that work. And then when we find something that does work, we can ensure widespread adoption to end this problem. Sexual assault and abuse of people with disabilities often goes unreported. If you or someone you care about has a disability and has been sexually assaulted or abused, the most important thing to know is that it is never the victim's fault. Help and support are always available. So, how big is the problem? So people with disabilities are victimized by crime at higher rates than the rest of the population. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, the term disability as used by the Department of Justice in the NCVS includes a wide range of limitations such as sensory, so vision, hearing, cognitive, self-care, and ambulatory or mobility limitations. People with different disabilities may face different challenges and have very different needs. Some disabilities may put people at higher risk for crimes like sexual assault or abuse. So people with disabilities may be less likely to be taken seriously when they make a report of sexual assault or abuse. They may also face challenges in accessing services to make a report in the first place. For example, someone who is deaf or deaf-blind may face challenges accepting communication or accessing communication tools like a phone to report the crime or get help. Many people with disabilities may not understand or lack information about healthy sexuality and the types of touching that are appropriate or inappropriate. This can be especially challenging if a person's disability requires other people to touch them to provide care. So consent is crucial. Consent is crucial when any person engages in sexual activity, but it plays an even bigger and potentially more complicated role when someone has a disability. Some disabilities may make it difficult to communicate consent to participate in sexual activity, and perpetrators may take advantage of this. People with disabilities may also not be able be given the same education about sexuality and consent that people without disabilities receive. In addition, someone who has a developmental or intellectual disability may not have the ability to consent to sexual activity as defined by state laws. In many instances, the person who has a disability may rely on the perpetrator for care or support, making it even more difficult to come forward. Take steps to reduce the risk of something happening to a loved one by asking prospective caregivers questions about safety and standards of care. So, consent laws in Texas. Now, when we talk about consent, we always have to look at the consent laws for your state because they vary from state to state. So, let's say you happen to find us and you are in Virginia or Ohio or something like that, you would need to look up the consent laws for your state. So, for the consent laws in our state, Texas, there is a lack of consent if a person engages in a sexual act with another person by forcible compulsion or with a person who is incapable of consent because he or she is physically helpless, mentally defective, or mentally incapacitated, or because of a victim's age. Mentally defective means that a person suffers from a mental disease or defect that renders the person incapable of understanding the nature and consequences of a sexual act or unaware a sexual act is occurring. Note, a determination that a person is mentally defective shall not be based solely on the person's IQ. Okay, this entire thing is, if you Google consent laws in Texas, this is exactly how it is written and this is exactly what it says. So mentally incapacitated means, according to our Texas consent laws, means that a person is temporarily incapable of appreciating or controlling the person's conduct as a result of the influence of a controlled or intoxicating substance, administering to the person without the person's consent, or that renders the person unaware a sexual act is occurring. Physically helpless means that a person is unconscious, physically unable to communicate a lack of consent, or rendered unaware that a sexual assault or a sexual act is occurring. A nursing home patient was unable to communicate a lack of consent and thus was physically helpless within meaning of statute for attempted rape purposes. Victim was blind, unable to speak, and confined to a bed or wheelchair, and a victim could only grunt, raise her hand, and shake her head from side to side to communicate. No, when criminality of conduct depends on a person's being incapable of consent because he or she is mentally defective or mentally incapacitated, it is an affirmative defense that the actor reasonably believed that the victim was capable of consent. That is our consent laws in Texas. I implore you to look up the consent laws for your state and see all that it says and really read it. So, responders need to recognize and acknowledge that many women who seek services, including legal support, often have had previous experiences of having their potential underestimated and being undermined. As a result of the limited skills of individual workers and agencies, barriers are created for women, barriers to accessing services that facilitate their healing. It is suggested that disabled women, in particular women with cognitive-related disabilities who are survivors of violence, most often do not seek justice from the time they make the report. At all points along the continuum, from reporting to police through the court process, stereotypical views about disabled women prevail and have a significant impact on a woman's experience obtaining justice. An example of systematic ableism is found in the DAI case, whereby the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, and the Council of Canadians with Disabilities served as interveners. The DAI case involved an adult woman with an intellectual disability who reported that her stepfather was sexually assaulting her. The woman provided a video statement to the police and gave evidence at the preliminary inquiry. However, the case collapsed when it was originally brought to the courts, and the accused was acquitted on the basis that the trial judge found that the woman survivor/plaintiff had failed to show that she understood the duty to speak the truth and held that she was not competent to testify. The Ontario Court of Appeal affirmed this result. This case highlighted the need to recognize that women and men with cognitive mental-based disabilities need specific types of support in order to communicate and participate in a fair and equitable manner in making decisions and in participating in a court of law. This young woman never gave up, and now the highest court in the country has restored her and all women with disabilities a right to a fair and just trial. The case of Betty Ann Gagnon is an example of both systematic ableism and individual forms of ableism in relation to her treatment by her family prior to her death in 2009. In October 2013, the Edmund Court of the Queen's Bench announced that the sentencing in the case of Betty Ann Gagnon, a woman with an intellectual disability and visual impairment who died under the care of her sister and brother-in-law in November 2009. Both faced multiple charges, including manslaughter, failure to provide the necessities of life, criminal negligence causing death, unlawful confinement, and assault and conspiracy to commit extortion. Betty Ann Gagnon died because her caregivers failed to provide the necessities of life for her and easily abused her because they had reason to believe they could get away with it. Disability activists say this is a travesty of justice for young women who had no voice. In spite of calls made by Betty Ann's niece regarding her safety and well-being, the system that is there to serve and protect us all failed her. Ableism permeates our society. It is a form of violence against self-identified women that occurs at both individual and systematic levels. Ableism defines a woman by her disability and focuses on her deviation from the norm rather than on recognizing her individuality in specific sets of experiences. Ableism, sexism, and other forms of oppression put self-identified women with disabilities at an increased risk of experiencing a range of violence and create barriers to accessing the very responses that can increase safety and facilitate healing. Policies and procedures need to include ableism as a form of violence and to address it through program audits, supervision, training curricula, and public education campaigns. While concerned about the impact of ableism and autism on men and women, the goal of this paper and this presentation was to name ableism as a form of violence against women, to increase awareness and understanding about its existence and serious impacts, and to ensure it is on everyone's agenda. So, any questions? So, I hope that you learned something. I know that this presentation was very heavy, as they all are. But I implore you to share this with your friends. I always challenge you to share it with at least 10 friends who you think needs to know this information. We all need to know this information. This should be public knowledge. All of these oppression systems, because when we have oppression, we have sexual violence. They correlate with one another, which is why we did this series to show how each different oppression, each different ism impact sexual violence, because when there is oppression, there is that power and control, which if you've seen my presentations on consent and myths and facts around sexual violence, the root cause of sexual violence is the unhealthy need and unhealthy want for power and control. And so when we are oppressing people, it leaves that power and control aspect of it open to put more people at risk. And we want to end sexual violence. So if you want to end sexual violence, if you want to be a change, turn on our post notifications so that you can be a part of all of our education presentations, share our videos, like, comment, and all of that, just to be able to spread the word and make sure that you're aware and educated and empowered in your education about sexual violence and all of its causes. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that you learned something. If you did, give this video a like, and I will see you next Thursday at 10 a.m. As we talk about ways to get involved with counseling and what counseling looks like. We'll have a guest speaker, and I hope that you tune in. So I will see you next Thursday at 10 a.m. Bye.